Welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Yo.
Hello. Today we are finishing up our discussion of Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, the final book in our series Alternate Histories, Alternate Realities. Our discussion today may contain spoilers. We did previously post a mostly spoiler-free review episode, which you can find in the archive. That was a couple of weeks ago. Next week, we will wrap up our series by talking about all three books that we read: Never Let Me Go, Rodham, and Lincoln in the Bardo. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. If you'd like to chat with us, you can find us on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at our Canonical Pod.
One question I saw pop up a lot from people online, often among readers who didn't like the book, was why do these children never try to leave? Why do they not run away to live in seclusion somewhere? First of all, do you have an answer for this?
I mean, where would they go? The whole country has bought into this idea, them included, that they are meant to be donors. Where would they even go to?
There are woods in England, right?
So a life in the woods?
I feel like that's a very American point of view, that you could just find some secluded wilderness area and just become, like a sovereign citizen or something, and you just live off the land. I don't know how feasible it is generally, but also how feasible it would be in the UK, which is an island, first of all, and much smaller than the US and has less wilderness.
James, are you telling me that your condition about this is fiction, you can do whatever you want, somehow doesn't apply here anymore?
What do you mean by my condition?
In our Rodham discussion, when I was asking about how can you ignore certain facts of reality, you said, this is speculative fiction. You can do whatever you want.
Okay, but I'm just saying, the idea that if you have a society, you go by the rules of what the society has set up, right? If the society has bought into this idea that everyone does this, that's the central tenet of the book. It doesn't make sense then that you could then think to avoid that by just living in the woods, when no one in society would even conceive of that as viable. But I also do think that this is the difference between an American point of view and a British point of view. Because in a lot of American science fiction novels, like Octavia Butler, people do run away to some secluded area to create their own, freehold or whatever. It is much more common in the American thought. I think this idea in this British novel would be more anathema. It just doesn't seem to belong.
I don't think we know enough about the world of the novel to know whether it's possible or not. Like, we know that they practice this in the UK. We have no idea about what's going on in the rest of the world. I think Ishiguro could have explained that this is the law in the UK and perhaps the law somewhere else, but don't you think that explaining so much about the technicalities of the situation would ruin the atmosphere that he's created?
Yeah, I think so. But I don't even think this is an important question. I feel like this question misses the point of the book. And I think the book actually does have answers for it. You have to make the connections yourself. But I think their education, or their what feels like a lacking education, I think we discussed that previously. I think you can point to that and show a correlation to how they never even consider leaving.
Yeah.
To them just not really being aware of options.
I think that's part of it. Yeah, like this is what I was saying last week. Like, the type of book something is shows you how it should be read and where you should ignore gaps in your knowledge and suspend disbelief. And like, I could see why some people would say, well, just leave the UK or hide in the forest. But they are not listening to the book. They're not listening to what Ishiguro is showing you he wants to think about.
Right. They're trying to go outside the bounds of the book, I guess.
Also, one of the main ideas, I guess, that Ishiguro is concerned with is this, not just in this book, but in almost all of his work, is this idea of duty or obligation. And so I think that question, it is important in that regard because it kind of makes you think about that. Like, perhaps one reason why they don't is, it's what they're meant to do.
To go back to your point that is a chiefly American point of view, James, do you see that as going hand in hand with what you just said as well? I feel like the British mentality is maybe more duty bound than the American.
Yeah.
It's not just about space, and it's not just about, there's this independent idea, maybe it's incorrect, but there's this sense of independence and I can do whatever I want in the US. Whereas I don't know if that holds true in Great Britain.
You could say it's related to class. If you watch Downton Abbey, a lot of it is about doing one's duty and what one is supposed to do.
Sticking to your station.
I mean, you would never see a show like Downton Abbey created in the US. I mean, it would be so difficult to take Downton Abbey and translate it. Like, how would that even work? Where you have some kind of, oligarch, a Silicon Valley type, and a mansion full of servants who love serving him and doing their duty, right? Like, it doesn't even make sense. You can't really conceive of it. It just does not work in the US. I mean, even if you take away that distance of time, Downton Abbey is so uniquely British that as an American watching it, you kind of feel like this is not really about my culture, right? Like, this is about something foreign.
Yeah, I guess Roots is about something slightly different.
Yeah, a different takeaway.
James, you think that is one of the main focuses of the book?
Right, Downton Abbey.
Yes, Downton Abbey. One of my favorite things about this book is how easy it is, at least for me, to overlay different theories and ways of looking at the text. So, for example, some of the ethical concerns I could see applied here are things like race, cloning, obviously cloning, medical testing, like Henrietta Lacks, entering the workforce, marriage and love, art, and cultural indoctrination.
The first one you mentioned, though, Sam, you mentioned race. I'm not sure I see that.
Is it because you just generally don't see race?
Yeah.
You're a post-racial enlightened white man.
They're all white to me.
Well, I will say that Henrietta Lacks, that figure, popped up in my head first. From there, I moved into race. I think the idea of there being multiple tiers of people in society and not having a say which you belong to. However, I think that these are all very different discussions, and only the ethics of cloning is brought up directly. And then art, love, and cultural indoctrination are more implied issues. The other ones I mentioned, I inferred completely on my own. So, were you thinking about any of these while you guys were reading?
I mean, definitely art. I think art is a major part of the novel. Entering the workforce, I think, is used just kind of tangentially. It's just used to show what's missing from their lives because they don't really have the opportunity to plan for a future in the way that most young people do. So it's just creating this void for them.
But for me, when I say entering the workforce, I don't mean this void of them not being able to join the workforce the way, let's say, the possibles that they see are already in the workforce. What I mean is the book acting as a metaphor for a life in the workforce, the sort of death of the self that you go through by having to enter into a career.
It's a very dark attitude from Sam. I don't know if I like this new version of Sam.
This is the oldest version of Sam.
I think you're right. I mean, that is a bleak way of looking at it, but you could say that our education and our training kind of is overdetermined. What we do in life always closes off other avenues or other potentials. And the most extreme example of that is these young people who have no choice but to do this one thing. It's kind of hyperbole in that sense. But what's interesting to me, I guess, is that even though it can be read like that, it's entirely opposite on the page. Like when I read these characters thinking about work and looking at like open planned offices, they're almost wistful, like they're in love with it. And it's not an ironic sort of gaze, like they really look at it dreamily.
I'd like to bring up something kind of tangential to these ideas, which is, what do you think we are supposed to feel about all this? I mean, obviously, we feel that it's wrong because we are told from a specific point of view with quite a bit of pathos. But we do get some bits of information, like the prevailing thought being that these clones do not need education, like they're essentially lab grown meat. I mean, how are we supposed to feel about this, and how did you guys feel about it? These people obviously are not lab grown meat, so I'm assuming that you guys think that they should be given this education. The assumption here is that this program continues. We're taking the discontinuation of this program off the table. Let's say this cloning and farming program will remain in place. Should they still be taught and treated like, normal kids?
Well, I think ultimately what the novel says to me is that you can do that, but if you don't take abolishing the program off the table, it's pointless. Treating them like real people and having them draw pictures and do things like that is hopelessly inadequate to the life that you're giving them. That's the message that I take from it. Yeah.
The comparison I draw is like if you eat cage-free poultry versus factory-farmed poultry. Obviously, you want the chickens to run free, right? You don't want them to be in darkness, like 23 hours of the day or whatever the factory farms do. And you don't want them to be cooped up, literally, for all that time and peck each other to death. So there is some benefit to cage-free poultry, but vegans or vegetarians would say that that's still not far enough. Is that a similar argument?
I think it is, but I think that the response is still easy to come by. That the obvious answer is that a cage-free existence comes so close to a quote unquote natural existence for a chicken that it might be good enough. But a life spent drawing pictures and reading novels does not come anywhere near close enough to a quote unquote normal human life. So you could talk about humans like they're chickens, but it's quite clearly not a fair comparison.
Is there a point to it then, to raise these people more humanely, to keep them cage free, give them some philosophy, let them draw a couple of pictures? Is there a point to that? I mean, if they're going to be harvested and we're not going to get rid of this organ harvesting program, is there a point to raise people humanely for organ harvesting?
The realization at the end of the book, when they go to Madame and Miss Emily's, that was more along the lines of not so much we want to show people that you are human and therefore you shouldn't be harvested, but they were trying to show they are like human, they have souls, and thus it is important to continue the education this way, right? They were trying to justify the education, not justify abolition.
I agree with that. I think for me personally, this argument surrounding the soul, it doesn't really mean anything to me.
That was more of a question, though, to you. That I was asking. The administrators of the school were not trying to justify abolition, correct? They were just trying to justify their own existence as teachers.
Well, I think they were just saying that these people deserve a better life, not that they should not be organ donors.
What if we take the extreme from having a very long life before donating to having no life at all before donating? Like, I think you'd have to also reckon with what kind of lifestyle they could have that would make it better than just possibly growing organs in a lab. Like, if these people got to live 20 years just like eating ice cream and getting blowjobs all day long, like that seems like a pretty good lifestyle. And then you give up your organs at 20. That might beat out just harvesting organs, growing them in a lab, right? But if you can't beat no life, then whatever you're doing is wrong. Like whatever you're doing has to be better than these people not existing.
I agree. It seems to me having the school and having the school be as good as it can be is much better than any alternative. Even if they are bound to learn what they're missing, it seems infinitely more cruel to have them, chained up or not experience anything in the world and just live like a chicken in a box.
And we don't know exactly what the conditions are for the people who are at those normal schools or whatever they're called. I mean, maybe they're not even schools, but I suspect there's probably a lot of abuse, right?
But as you pointed out, or one of you pointed out, when we see those kids in the cottages, they seem fine.
Yeah, they're reading about philosophy and yeah, they seem normal. I'll just bring up one more thing that, I mentioned earlier. I just want to pull on this thread for a little bit, which is, does it matter that they have or don't have a soul? Because it seems like that's something that is important to those ladies or to people who are discussing this issue in this fictionalized world. But to me, it seems like that doesn't matter at all, unless you understand soul as shorthand for something else. I mean, that's the only way I can understand it. Not soul in the biblical traditional sense of a soul, like, the philosophical soul, but soul as a stand-in for they are human.
Yes, having a soul is a shorthand for humanism. These people deserve certain treatment because they are humans. They can't be treated like animals where we use them for their meat because they have a soul.
Yeah, I feel like the whole point of having that discussion and not actually talking about abolition is kind of the point of the book. That we're going to talk about this one thing, but if you think about it enough, you'll see it doesn't actually matter. To get to the point of discussing whether these people have souls, but not go a step further and discuss whether this whole program is ethical at all, seems to be not the direct point of the book, but the point that the book is reaching for, the point that the book is asking you to get to on your own. I mean, that kind of brings me to my other question about this, which is, does it hurt the novel's messaging, if the novel does have one, that these ethical discussions largely happen off the page? Whether you're talking about abolition or whether you're talking about these other implied issues or inferred issues that I brought up earlier.
I would say that there are different levels. There are some books that have no ideas and nothing really substantial to say, and those are the worst. And then there are novels like this where it uses a lot of loaded imagery and a lot of loaded situations that obviously prompt this kind of thinking, and that's obviously better. But then the highest level would be a novel that proposes a new idea or a new way of thinking on its own. And I don't think that Ishiguro does that. So it's better than a lot of other novels, but it doesn't offer something new. I think it's missing the kind of new content that I would really like.
I remember off air, I mentioned that I read someone complaining that you can only read this as a figurative novel, that to read it literally, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember his exact complaint, but to read it literally, it kind of falls apart. I think we kind of laughed about it, but it kind of sounds like you're in that camp, Ed, that you want something more to it.
I think that the ethical ideas involved, like I said in the last episode, are not elaborated enough. And, like I said in the last episode, this is because it's not really interested in that kind of a discussion. This is not an ideas novel, it's a feelings novel. It shows you the feeling of being a clone, but it doesn't really deal, I think, very directly with the complexities of the ethical situation. That to me, I think, is okay. But if it were going to do that, if it were going to offer the ideas, the best thing it could do is to offer a new idea on its own.
I think one of the things that I liked about this is because it's kind of vague in that way, because it doesn't go into specifics about a lot of these things. I know we talked about this in a previous episode, that forced me to consider why it was taking this approach. What's the point of having such vagaries and such a focus on feelings rather than ideas, as you put it? But I can see how that would be either frustrating or not going far enough. Sort of related. At the end of the novel, Tommy starts putting distance between himself and Kathy. What does it mean to you that Tommy starts associating with the other donors more after he learns the truth of his existence?
I think it's on the most surface level or psychological level. It's his way of dealing with his impending death, his mortality. So he's discussing this or dealing with his upcoming death with other people who are also about to die.
Yeah, it felt kind of like a support group in that way.
I think this is connected to what we were talking about before about ideas and feelings. I think that this move away from Kathy is kind of Ishiguro pointing towards the isolation of lived experience and the feelings that come from it. Even though Tommy and Kathy are very intimate, they're lovers, Kathy will never understand what it's like to be a donor. She hasn't actually done it. And the only people who will understand it are the people who have done it. And I think that feeling is important to Ishiguro, is he wants to point to something like this is the limit of intellectual thought. You cannot read about or think about people having this done to them and understand it. The only way you would really understand how they feel is if it happened to you.
And also the fact that this relationship ends is important because the reader should not be placed in a position where the reader thinks, oh, well, maybe their, quote, love will go on, end quote. I mean, it's important to the book that there is this termination.
I feel like that also goes hand in hand with a discussion about abolition. Like, if you can't reach for what you really want, if you can't reach the point of having a full life and going beyond this donor situation, I mean, why pretend otherwise?
I think that's true. I think that this is connected to the idea of the art being valuable in terms of showing the fullness of their experience. I think that art is one of the ways that people try to break out of this kind of isolation of personal experience that I talked about. Like, we want to show the way we live in a way that other people can understand. And I think the reason why Miss Emily and the Madame are so attracted to that idea is it's a way of them saying, look, we understand who these people are, and we have access to the entirety of their experience. But I think that Tommy, especially not being creative and then also rejecting Ruth later on, is saying, even through art, you cannot form a connection to another person such that they will really understand what your situation is like and how it feels to be you specifically.
In some ways, I feel like the book's message about art being this salvation sort of thing is not good enough to raise one above where you are. Like, if you took any of the ideas I brought up before, for example, entering the workforce, if you see this as a metaphor for losing oneself in a career that is unfulfilling, for example, I think you can read this as showing that education and art will not ultimately save you. However, even after learning the truth, Tommy continues to draw, right? He continues to do it more in secret after that point, but he does continue. I feel like you could read it that way as well, that maybe it is offering some sort of salvation.
It's maybe a personal gratification or personal satisfaction, but it doesn't show something private about Tommy to other people. I think that that's probably the reason why Ishiguro always describes the drawings in very odd terms. They are these strange little animals. It's not Tommy drawing a building and everybody says, "Oh, I know that building." It's Tommy drawing something that's really inscrutable and it puzzles people.
It's comforting to him, but only to him.
Yeah.
Sam, you mentioned earlier that one of the ideas of the book is art. And whenever this comes up now, I can't help but think about Station 11 and its message on the banner, which is like, what art will survive, or whatever it was. Is the message or the idea that Ishiguro puts forward about art here substantially more nuanced than it was in Station 11, where it was literally a banner, on a wagon about art surviving, or art is what makes
Art
us
is
whatever.
important.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Because I will point out that Tommy does keep on drawing, and Kath does produce this work, this testimony. So we do have art at the end, quote, surviving these people or donors. But at the same time, you also have the art produced by the children who get placed in this museum, and it seems like it's just a fad. Like people will kind of look at it and it's like a way of raising money. It's not substantially anything besides, I mean, for me, it seems like it was just a way to get more support. It really didn't mean anything beyond that. So is this book saying anything about art substantially?
I mean, this goes back to what I was saying about how this book is essentially vague about its messaging. So I think you can read it in multiple ways, because I think I see it that way as well. But I think you can see the salvation aspect, but you can just as easily see the art as meaningless, especially when compared with what we've already talked about, how abolition is, as far as we know, not really on the table.
I think it does have much more to say than Station 11. I think it's actually quite opposite Station 11. The banner that they had in that novel is something like survival is insufficient. And the implied message is that you need art in addition to survival to justify life. And that message is simplistic to me because it's just talking about art as this kind of transcendent other that goes beyond normal life. And I think what Ishiguro does that's much better is he says, art is important, but here are the limits of art. Here is what art can do for people, and here is what art can't do for people. So it's a much more complete idea or a complete statement about what art means to people rather than just saying art is good.
Well, it is kind of the opposite, because it is saying that art will not keep you alive.
Yeah.
It will not save you.
It's limited. I mean, I think the art in the novel is still important, but it's not the transcendent, perfect thing that I think Station 11 wants it to be.
It ends up being a much quieter salvation than Station 11 would have you believe. A much more personal, internal thing.
All right, we'll stop here. Thank you for joining us today. If you thought we were off base with our reading, you can let us know on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can leave us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back to wrap up our discussion. We'll talk about all 3 of the books that we read for this series. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.